Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the OHBM Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Bandettini, and today I'm excited to be talking with Dr. Christopher Baldassano, an associate professor at Columbia University and the head of the Dynamic Perception and Memory Lab. Chris received his undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from Princeton University in 2009, graduating summa cum laude. He received his PhD in computer science from Stanford in 2015 under the guidance of Fei-Fei Li and Diane Beck. After a postdoc at Princeton under the direction of Yuri Hasson and Ken Norman, he was recruited to Columbia University in 2018. He has pioneered the use of naturalistic stimuli, hidden Markov models, and multivariate processing to better understand and characterize the subtle dynamics that emerge when the brain processes, stores, learns, and retrieves events. The key idea is that of event scripts. Event scripts are neural frameworks that act as cognitive scaffolds upon which autobiographical memories are built. As we experience the world, we combine relevant, commonly repeating information over time so that we can react or act on it more efficiently in future experiences. He's already published a number of papers exploring these event scripts as they relate to learning, are influenced by emotion, and vary with age from infants to older adults. His approach artfully balances model-driven versus data-driven research and is forging new ground in our understanding of how the brain processes information. Here we dig into all of these things, and talking with Chris was probably one of the fastest 80 minutes I've experienced in a very long time, as we covered quite a bit of ground, and I was completely fascinated. His research is truly inspiring, and his findings open up new vistas in exploration. This was a showcase of some of the very best fMRI research out there. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, today I'm with Dr. Chris Baldassano, and I've known of his work for years, and I really had my attention caught by when he was giving a lecture at an NIH workshop on naturalistic stimuli. And I saw his talk, and I thought that I was actually struck by how clear it was. Maybe I'll include the link to that talk. It's still online. It's a super clear talk, very very nicely presented. And so I wanted to, ever since that, I was sort of thinking in the back of my head, I wanted to have him on the podcast, and reading through his papers now, I'm happy that he's here. So thanks, Chris. Welcome.
Yeah, great to be here.
So I usually like to start out the podcast with talking a little bit about kind of like how you got to where you are right now. I mean, you're at Columbia University doing amazing work. You worked with Yuri Hasson at Princeton. You worked at Stanford. So maybe trace through and maybe highlight any sort of key moments or key people that, when you first got interested in, computer science, but then moved from computer science to neuroscience. It seems like that was sort of kind of went right into it. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I had a little bit of a wandering trajectory into neuroscience, which is something I like about neuroscience, that I feel like many people ended up there through different routes. But yeah, so as an undergraduate, I was studying electrical engineering. I was doing a lot of like robotics stuff. And so I was on the Princeton team that competed in the DARPA self-driving car challenge.
Wow.
So that was in 2007. So yeah, we were proud that we made it to the final round. I think we were the only undergrad only team that made it to the final round. We, immediately got demolished by professional engineers from Stanford and MIT. But so I was into robotic stuff. I was interested in sort of cognitive science generally. I did this intelligent systems kind of minor at Princeton. So I had taken some cognitive psychology classes, and something I was always kind of interested in the back of my mind. Yeah, I went to grad school for computer science thinking I was going to continue doing robotics kinds of stuff. And then, a few things happened that first year of grad school. One was that the way Stanford computer science worked at the time, they've changed this since then, but it used to be that you didn't get admitted to a lab and you also didn't do rotations. So you would show up and you had one semester to try to figure out what lab was going to take you. So this was a stressful period for all of us of trying to, we had funding for that one semester basically to try to find someone to sponsor us past that. And so the robotics labs I had been interested in didn't really have a spot for me. And so I was, lost a little bit of trying to decide what even my options were or what I wanted to do. And ended up getting kind of lucky that Fei Li at the time, she had just started this collaboration with Dan Beck at University of Illinois. They had been collaborating in general for years since Fei used to be in that department, but they were starting a new project trying to apply some machine learning techniques to neuroimaging data. And so they were looking for computer science people that were interested in cognition in the brain to try to help with this project. And so this was super exciting to me. I was like overjoyed that there was a spot for this and that it was something that matched things I had been interested in at Princeton as well. And so this is where I sort of started moving more in this neuroscience direction. That I started as just kind of the data analysis person. And so I was analyzing data that other people had already collected, and then started moving more and more into the psychology parts, designing and running my own experiments. And so by the time I finished my PhD, I was really primarily working in cognitive neuroscience and studying the visual system, starting to think about studying memory and other kinds of systems. And then looking for a postdoc, I ended up at Princeton, primarily because of just the really exciting kind of data collection that was going on there. That when I interviewed, I had a chance to see Janice Chen. She was doing her Sherlock data collection stuff at the time of having people watch full movies and then just do a totally free recall of what you remember in the movie. And so I just thought this was so cool. The fact that it was like working at all kind of blew my mind. That really broke all the rules about how you were supposed to do fMRI. Like you're supposed to have, very precise kind of controls and timing. You're definitely not supposed to talk in the scanner. That I was always told that would like make the data unusable. And so you have people just doing this behavior for like 30 minutes of just like talking about stuff. And so I probably wouldn't have been brave enough myself to like do that experiment, but Janice had already been getting data on it and showing that this kind of approach could work, and that you could actually see, for example, reactivation of brain states during this memory sequence. And so that just seemed to me like a potential like start of something in the field that just seemed really exciting. That was so different from stuff that I and most other people were doing at the time. And so that was where I got. Once I went to Princeton, got more interested in thinking about naturalistic perception, thinking about memory systems, thinking about different kinds of recall of complex real world information. And then after a couple of years, in 2018, I started my own lab at Columbia. And that's primarily focused on those kinds of techniques and questions that I developed during my postdoc.
Okay. It's always interesting. I mean, it's exciting to do like naturalistic stimuli. And it's sort of, the idea is, there's these two camps where one where you want to do extremely precise experiments on getting the brain to do just the right thing so you can tease it apart. Another one is sort of the principle of sort of casting this net, and with the idea that there's many more subtleties that you're not seeing when you try to control the brain to do a certain way and have a certain model, and that you're picking up. But then the art is sort of picking it up in a way that you can actually get meaning from it. And so obviously you've mastered that. And it's also an interesting thing. And this is sort of along the lines of, starting in computer science and electrical engineering and then robotics and whatever, is the idea that, you have two types of people in fMRI, in some sense, where people who develop methods kind of, and I'm sort of in that camp too, is sort of like, developing methods with a lot of questions in mind, but sort of like honing in on a question, but then developing methods to the question instead of doing it at the same time, and then getting really interesting information out of the method, and then sort of then focusing on the brain. Some people just have questions in the brain and they find methods to answer it. And I'm not sure which is best. I mean, they all converge eventually, and we all become, all the technical people become neuroscientists, and all the neuroscientists who embrace this become technical people. But you've definitely been in that camp where you're both and doing very well.
Yeah. These questions of working on both methods and questions. I mean, I think a trap that I fell into at some points was getting sort of overly enamored of methods, or some new thing would come out in the computer science or machine learning literature. And I think, okay, let's like try out applying to some brain data and see what comes out. And that usually was not super fruitful, in the sense that that it's usually pretty hard to interpret stuff that comes out of this if you're just taking off the shelf kinds of methods. And so, yeah, what I've tried to do is think more about from the science side of, what are the questions that we sort of wish we could answer that are maybe outside the kinds of analyses we currently have. And then can we think about, finding methods that are maybe that already exist that are like close to what we want that we could tweak, or maybe we have to start something more from scratch, right? But developing the methods with a specific scientific goal in mind. And so, and I mean, often for many of the questions we want, the methods don't have to be super sophisticated by like computer science standards, in the sense that, most of the stuff we've done in my lab is sort of repurposing relatively well established kinds of stuff in computer science. But yeah, the real challenge is sort of figuring out like what are the right tools to use that will give you something that you can interpret, that could allow you to have well controlled kinds of experiments. And so that's often where we spend a lot of time thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely kind of an art in some sense. I mean, you have to iteratively think a lot about like, oh, well, what are we missing here? What are we doing here? What are we assuming? And it's sort of like this constant, there's no formula for doing it right. And I guess that's why there's not that many people who do it well. But yeah, or maybe there's a growing number, hopefully. But I mean, you have sort of developed, I mean, it seems like at Stanford, you sort of were thinking about the hippocampus. I mean, you did some papers on hippocampus and memory and navigation. And to me, as I read your papers, it struck me, I mean, this will be a recurring theme in some senses, the whole idea of the brain sort of building context, having these motifs of activation, and that's sort of like our sort of context packages in some sense. And that's sort of that theme, it seems like it started in graduate school, and it's sort of been growing all the way through in that sense.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, at least where I started in grad school was really on sort of vision science
Yeah.
projects. And so we were interested in scene perception, meaning like, how do you perceive and understand photographic full images, which, at least at the time was considered pretty naturalistic, as opposed to like tilted edges and things. And so,
Yeah.
so I started getting very interested in some of these brain regions, especially like the parahippocampal place area. These are brain regions that are generally thought of as like visual scene processing kinds of regions. So they respond a lot to things like photographs. And then maybe didn't go into looking for the context memory pieces, but sort of discovered that like within these regions, there's really different parts of them that seem to be doing pretty different things. And so there are some parts of these regions that really are just responding to visual stuff on the screen. And you can even trigger them with like pretty simple kind of particular frequencies and things from the visual input. But then there was other parts that are doing something that seems a lot more complicated. That there was this really cool paper from Russell Epstein's lab that came out around that time that was showing that parts of these brain regions would give you the same response if you showed a picture of the inside and the outside of the same building, as long as it was for UPenn students that were familiar with this particular UPenn building. Took a Temple student from down the street, they didn't know what the inside of the building looked like, you didn't get that same response, right? And so this to me was like, there's just a really interesting transformation happening here between visual input and then connecting to your actual knowledge about the world, right? And that's sort of like what you want as the output of these systems, is like mapping it into things that you know about. And so that got me a lot. So that was sort of my path into thinking about how do you connect sensory information into these kinds of maps and schemas and contextual relationships that you have learned about. And then, of course, there's some ongoing process where you're trying to update those things over time. And it starts getting complicated very quickly because you're immediately going kind of beyond the bounds of stuff that's in the stimulus. And it's going to depend on things people know and the experiences they've had in their life, which, is, at least for someone initially doing like visual perception research, was something we tried to avoid of there being any information people could bring from outside the experiment that was going to matter. But then I think now I'm maybe most interested in those pieces as really what a big part of cognition is that you are trying to figure out how the things you're experiencing right now connect to things you already know about.
Yeah. Yeah. And that whole theme is, I mean, obviously really interesting as far as how the brain, like, right. I mean, basically, I just remember first thinking about this a little bit. I mean, more when, Princeton came with his models of, basically the idea that the brain is constantly building models of the world, and they're being updated by how different, their experience is from what your expectations are. But then you build these into chunks, and everyone kind of knows from cognitive neuroscience that experts basically chunk information in some sense. but I mean, we kind of do this all the time in many different ways and everything. So, and it's actually really interesting that you're sort of probing, to me at least, it seems that you're probing this directly in some sense. Okay, so why don't we go, right into the paper that seems like your most cited paper. I mean, it's still, it's funny because it's still, still continuing to grow in citation rate. And that's the one that you published in 2017 in Neuron, Discovering Event Structure in Continuous Narrative Perception. And then you had other related ones with the one in Journal of Neuroscience with representation of real world event schemas during narrative perception. So why don't you, and like you said, you brought to bear, a very straightforward, something that's been known in years in signal processing, hidden Markov models. But for people who don't really know exactly what that means, why don't you maybe walk through the paper and not really the whole paper, but like walk through how you thought of it and basically the essence of what you're doing as far as that, either of those papers, maybe the first one.
Yeah, so this was work I started right after I got to Princeton. And yeah, the original motivation for this was basically trying to figure out things to do with this data that Janice had collected. And so, there's fMRI neuroimaging here of people watching like an hour of movie and then talking about it for 20 or 30 minutes. And so a question that Janice had already started working on a bit at the time was thinking about like, how could you try to line up these two things? And so this is, can we see something like a sequential reactivation during memory of the same brain patterns and brain states that you were in during the movie? And so you can think about a bunch of ways to do this. Some people have done things like this with like a sort of dynamic time warping thing where you're trying to figure out like which time points correspond with which ones. And so the approach that I suggested, and this was partly because I had used this approach for some other projects in the past, was this hidden Markov modeling approach that the basic assumptions of it are extremely simple. It's like a very simplifying assumption about how this sort of sequential reactivation works. The assumptions of the model are just that when you're watching a movie, you go through some sequence of pretty constant states. So like for, 10 seconds maybe, and we could talk about the time scale in a second here, but for some amount of time, some region of your brain is sitting in a relatively constant activity state, and then it switches to a new one. And there's some string of those things you go through, and then during retrieval, you go through that same string of states. And so it's almost certainly not a full description of what's going on in the true. There's a lot of dynamic things that are being missed by that. The kind of surprising thing is that very basic description actually captures a lot of what we see. Like if you just look at the sort of raw data, especially across participants, you can actually just like see in the raw data this kind of block structure where there are these relatively constant periods. And so the goal was to try to capture that kind of structure in a model. So I'm skipping over here about a year of me fighting with the like math and fitting pieces of this. So the challenge is that when you're fitting this model, we don't know necessarily like what the patterns how we should set the patterns, and we don't know when the switches are happening, and they're going to be happening at a different time during the movie and during the recall, because people's recall of a scene is not going to be exactly as long as the original scene was. And fMRI data is pretty noisy, especially for individual people, and so there's like a lot of uncertainty about exactly what the patterns are and where these switches are and things. And so so part of the trick here was coming up with a way that you could actually like fit this. And so there was some techniques that we sort of added on to the regular vanilla HMM to let it do this.
So basically this hidden Markov model is basically these voxelized patterns that are, that you arrive upon, with these states. And I mean, it's actually interesting because I just was doing some side research on this, and I saw this paper that came out. I mean, and it's interesting to differentiate. This paper came out about the same time by Badure, Smith, and Woolrich in PNAS, looking also at hidden Markov models, but in a very different way. It's actually looking at using networks as sort of the template, as opposed to voxelized patterns, which, they both seem to work very well. And one is looking at, brain states, like just, in resting states. And you're looking at brain states as you look at this naturalistic scene. And what's cool about what you did is that you had these models, and then you looked at the probability of a state occurring, and it just, it would happen. But then you saw the hippocampus showing, this transient activity at the beginning of each of these sort of, I don't know, what do they call it, a state or a motif or a schema or something. Yeah. And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So then, once we started fitting these models, I think initially we hadn't really even thought that carefully about these like state transition moments, in the sense that the main point of the model was to try to like figure out what these state patterns are and like, do you see the same state patterns at retrieval? And then something that kind of just like implicitly falls out of the model is that we can say like the moments when those switches happen. And then I think over time, I've gotten more and more interested in what's happening at those switches, that there's a lot of work. This is stuff by Jeff Zox sort of started this line of work, and many others have worked on this now, looking at these event boundary kinds of processes. And so there's actually something very cognitively meaningful that happens at these boundaries where you're doing things like resetting your working memory. It seems like you're laying down long-term memory traces. You're maybe trying to like set up a new event model for the new thing that's just about to start, and you're drawing on your knowledge of the world to set this up. And so there's a bunch of things happening. There's definitely the hippocampus is involved in at least some of these, and exactly which ones it's involved in is something we're still deciding, still researching. And so, but yeah, this is also something that ended up being really interesting to us, is that usually for most memory studies, you're sort of showing items one at a time. They're very discrete items that are sort of flashed on the screen, and you want to have a strong hippocampal response. That's an indication that you're laying down some kind of trace into long-term memory. And for the movies, it doesn't really look like that. The hippocampus, at least its overall activity, is pretty low a lot of the time. And then you see these sudden spikes up at these event boundaries. And so it seemed like there's maybe a different mode that's going on in this more naturalistic kind of dynamics, where there's kind of like key moments for this encoding. And so the size of this hippocampal response you get at the boundary is also related to subsequent memory processes, which makes it seem like there's something that you're doing that matters long term. And so, one challenge here is that because there's so many different things that might be happening at the boundary, it can be a little challenging in fMRI to figure out to sort of separate them. I've started doing some work the past couple of years using intracranial recordings as well, specifically looking at these boundary moments to see, if you have sort of more precise neural recordings, can we say something more about exactly how information is flowing around the brain at these boundaries?
Right.
Yeah, but that ended up being, it was not the original motivation for the model to try to find boundaries. But I think the fact that we were able to find those boundaries and find things associated with them ended up being one of the main parts of the paper.
Yeah, and it seems that to be able to create these multivoxel patterns, it seems like you have to have a pretty good signal to noise in your data. It seems like maybe a lot of people shy away from doing it on a voxel-wise pattern, maybe because they feel like, oh, there's not enough SNR. And so it seems like you had enough.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's much easier to fit these models if you have good SNR. And so one trick, at least for some of the fits here, is to do them at the group level. So we're, averaging across individuals, and there's fancier and simpler ways to do that. But at that level, then, you start having signals that are sort of much easier to fit. So another nice thing with this model is that it's, when it's estimating these patterns, it's basically averaging over time.
Okay.
And so that actually allows you to get pretty good estimates of these patterns as well.
Okay. So let me ask this. Let me just back up for a second in terms of, this is sort of built a little bit on Yuri Hasson's really cool work on looking at these time scales, showing that at very low level activation, you have, very rapid changes. And then you have, the higher up you go, prefrontal cortex is very long time scales up to, minutes. And certainly the prefrontal cortex is doing things, but there's sort of a stability over this longer period of time. That's interesting in terms of the hippocampal events only occur maybe coincident with the beginning of the longer events in that sense. And which also intuitively makes sense. You don't remember how the shading changed on a video. You remember kind of the semantics of what's going on as far as that's concerned. Yeah.
Yeah, this ended up being another one of the findings from this paper, is that we could try to estimate how often do these switches happen in different parts of the brain. And so, I think kind of surprising thing to me, at least, was that this kind of general structure of patterns that stay relatively constant and then switch, that's actually a pretty good description of brain activity almost in the whole brain while you're watching a movie. But there are very big differences in these time scales. And so in sensory regions, these switches are happening very frequently. And then the events that I think are maybe the most sort of cognitively interesting are these ones that are extending over tens of seconds or minutes, which is, at least by most neuroscience standards, very long compared to the kinds of neural signals we usually measure. And these are the ones that seem to be more related to long-term memory systems. And in some of the later work we did is also more related to things like the semantic properties of the scene and this kind of schematic structure, so how they relate to your prior knowledge and things like that. And so the question of how you build this kind of stable representation of rapidly changing sensory input, I think, is a really important question.
Yeah, yeah. And so the first question that came to my mind when I was reading that, I'm thinking, well, you probably did the experiment, and I'm sure maybe it's somewhere in a paper of yours or that I missed. But what if you changed the task completely? And what if you, instead of saying, "Oh, just watch the movie," you said, "Well, pay attention to, whenever there's a face or whenever there's some sort of change in the color or with, whatever, something that's relatively low level." Would you then get hippocampal activity at these shorter timescales?
Yeah, that is a great question. So we did something a little bit like that last year where we did have people listen to a story with different kinds of instructions to try to pay attention to different aspects of the story. And we found that did change the moments that people both behaviorally said were event boundaries and where we saw these moments where there were shifts in the brain. Now, these were both relatively high level aspects. And so we'd ask people to pay attention to, if there's a marriage proposal happening at a restaurant, they could think about the sequence of things that's happening that's restaurant related versus proposal related.
Yep.
So there is at least some ability to like change around these boundaries. Yeah, we're actually just starting a project now. This is a collaboration with Miriam Ali where we created these image sets in which we've tried to at least partially disassociate the low level and high level features of these images. And so we're doing these with these AI image generation systems where we can create images where we can specify where are like the dominant lines, the big edges in this image, and what are the textures used. And we can also specify what is the object and scene content of this image. And so you can have these models generate two images that can be easily recognized as corresponding to different scene categories, but actually at a low level have a lot of shared edges and textures between them. And so the idea here is that this allows us to create sequences of images where we could vary how quickly both the high level and low level features are changing. And we can also vary people's attention of, are they trying to pay attention to high or low level things? And so we're trying to use this as a tool to answer exactly this question of how flexible are these representations? To what extent can you like have a choice about what things you're sensitive to? My guess is that in early visual cortex, for example, you probably don't have a choice. Like I'm guessing that that's detecting edges no matter what. But in a lot of these higher level regions, our hope is that we'd see some flexibility in terms of that the kind of things they're tracking might depend on what your current goals are.
Yeah. Okay. So that's actually really cool too. I mean, right. I mean, there's the interplay of attention, and then attention, we're certainly, it can be, sort of a task driven, but sort of natural world attention is drawn to different things at different times, and sort of this very iterative process in one's brain. It also, there's one other part when I was reading your paper that kind of brought to mind the really cool work of Jack Gallant and Alex Huth. And their idea was that, this semantic information is stored everywhere in the brain. It's like this all this semantic space sort of, and it seems to match quite nicely with what you're doing in some sense, because you have, these motifs of that are sort of with higher order areas that sort of play out for a long period of time, and then they tend to build, or we'll get into the timing aspect too, but or change depending on experience. It's interesting. I mean, do you think that there's some sort of a matching of, of their data that shows different aspects of a scene at the semantic level are stored different areas? And I wonder if those components would make up your, hidden Markov models in, in some sense.
Yeah, that work was really cool. And yeah, that came out, or at least Alex was presenting that work around when I was finishing up my PhD. And so, I think that kind of approach is really nicely complementary to the kind of things that I was doing at the time and have often done, which are sort of these data-driven things where we start with the neuroimaging data and try to capture something about the structure there, right? As opposed to those models that can actually try to predict brain data from the stimulus, right? And understand the mapping between them. And so, yeah, the kinds of content in the narratives that evoked strong responses in the same brain regions I was interested in, it was really cool for me to see in Alex's work what those were. And they're often like pretty abstract kinds of ideas that are things about like locations or relationships or other things that I had been hypothesizing were probably making up these kinds of event models. And so it was really cool to be able to say something about what that content is. And then, yeah, it also brings up another question that I think I haven't answered yet, which is trying to understand there's more than one of these high level kinds of regions that shows these slow kind of stable event structures. And so like, why is there more than one? And right, I think one answer is that they are representing different kinds of content. And so like one thing you can see for some of these high level regions is that even parts of the brain that might have the same time scale in the sense that they have events that are the same length, the boundaries are not always aligned. And so you can have cases where different regions are like changing at different times. And so there is potentially something interesting there about sort of complementary coding across different brain regions, or it's probably also related to what you just mentioned about attention of there's like different potential kind of streams of information in the world that you could be choosing to pay attention to or make decisions about. And so you're sort of computing those things in parallel. And so something like an encoding model, yeah, is one way of trying to get access to like what are the different kinds of content these regions are representing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's cool, right? I mean, that would be actually interesting to somehow parse out what those Markov models actually are, and maybe have an experiment like Alex Huth's experiment, and then have those elements, and then try to see if which elements are components of that. That's yeah. I mean, that would be a huge work, but it would be interesting to bring it together. So I actually want to go back just before I get into the next part the question of what is the longest time scale? So as far as with Yuri's work, I think it was something like a minute, a couple minutes or so. And also, it's not really looking at co-activations. It's sort of looking at this template as it exists. And so it's semi-stable, but is there like a limit to like what our brains consider, maybe it's evolutionary determined, that the most interesting, important events to our survival are anywhere from, a few seconds to maybe 5 minutes or something. And or is it any longer?
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem like there is kind of a limit, at least of this kind of event we're talking about, where you're like maintaining some kind of working memory representation of stuff that's going on that usually doesn't last more than a few minutes. And so, I don't think this is a limitation of the neuroimaging. I think because we also see this in people that have hippocampal damage, for example, right? That have amnesia. That is also kind of the limit of how long that they can maintain a stable context of a conversation, for example. And so I think there is some inherent limitation in that is somewhere around that scale. And yeah, I guess one question is whether it's like an adaptive thing that's a good scale. Yeah. I think there also might just be some like biological challenges in, even maintaining neural activity for like things on the scale of seconds is in some ways kind of challenging. You need some kind of recurrent network that's going to keep things going. And so it's possible there's just some challenges of really keeping activity in a stable state for longer than that. And so yeah, that sort of means that anything beyond that is going to require some kind of reasoning or retrieval, or certainly we could think about events during your day or during your life that are on the scale of hours or months or years or something, right? When there's different parts of your life. But yeah, I would say that those are probably not things that you experience in the same direct way that you do these sort of minutes long event, in the sense that they're not really online in your mind all at the same time. And you could try to bring up pieces of them to try to think about what life was like during those times. But yeah, I think there is some sort of qualitative difference of these states that are longer than a couple minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just occurred to me now that it could be also a cool experiment to do this sort of experiment on, normal populations versus those with like ADHD. And are there naturally just shorter?
Yeah. I've done a little collaborative work. This is work with Aaron Heller that have tried to look at, for example, populations at risk of anxiety and depression. And we do see some differences in, for example, that they tend to have less stable events, especially in response to a stressor. And so this sort of ability to like maintain these stable states is something that might be implicated in a lot of kind of disorders.
That's interesting. I mean, fMRI is always looking for, things like biomarkers for early detection or whatever therapy, it could be an avenue as far as that's concerned. So the question occurred to me, so the hippocampus has this transient activity. What do you think is actually going on? What is the hippocampus doing? And actually then the question was, well, how does one know? How does one decide? Maybe it's based on the previous states. Maybe it's sort of this constant process of like what's interesting to then note ahead of time. It's a longer state to sort of make note of.
This hippocampal activity is something that we've looked at in a number of studies. It's a very strong effect. So it's like one of the initial now sort of validation checks that we do. If you have a movie stimulus, especially, you should see very strong offset responses in the hippocampus. And so we know at least a few things about them. So yeah, they're at the end of an event. So when a new event is starting, the size of this response is related to different kinds of memory measures for that event that's just ending now, which is actually a little counterintuitive because the response itself is happening during the beginning of this next event, but it's actually about the event that's not on the screen anymore. And so it predicts things like how well you're going to reinstate that event later. And some other labs have done shown some behavioral effects as well. And so, yeah, so it seems like it's doing something that's related to like either wrapping up or encoding or rapidly reactivating parts of this previous event that was just ending. We've looked at this, we've done some work looking at this like across ages, and this response is present down to the youngest kid data we have, which is maybe about age 7. In fact, it's actually bigger in the younger kids than in young adults. And so it seems like it's something that you rely on a lot just for creating episodic memories, maybe for younger kids that are their memories are more episodic in the sense that they have less prior world knowledge and context to use. It's happening even more. So that's at least one big piece of it. There's probably other stuff happening there as well that have to do with like scene construction kinds of processes for setting up this next event. That if you're trying to start sort of building associations, that even in the first few seconds of seeing the next scene in a movie, for example, you can usually there's some kind of establishing shot at the beginning of a scene that gives you a lot of information about like what the context is and like what kind of thing this is going to be. And so there's a bunch of processes happening there. At least some of those might be hippocampally dependent, the ones that involve more of these kinds of constructive associative processes. And so, yeah, so I mentioned we've started to look a little bit at intracranial data now. So looking specifically at hippocampal ripples, and there's a lot more of these kinds of sharp wave ripples, or these things that look like sharp wave ripples right around boundaries. So we think this is facilitating some kind of communication between the cortex and the hippocampus, although we're still trying to really understand the timing of those things. We're collecting some new data on that now. And so, I think this is something, again, this is a process that you really just like don't see at all in traditional stimuli where you sort of know what the units are, that if I, give you a word and you have to remember it, you like know what the thing is, and doesn't have that many pieces to it. And so this question of, after you've had an experience that's a couple minutes long, how do you like package that up into a memory trace? There's even just some biology questions here about like, we would usually think to wire together a new memory engram, you would need all the pieces to be online at the same time. And so how is that accomplished? Is it that you're like maintaining the earlier stuff? We have some evidence that you maybe reactivate earlier stuff. So things are stored in some kind of temporary format that allows you to bring them all back together at the end of the event in a way that allows for storage. And so, so that, like how you actually create a unified memory out of an experience that, by neural timescale standards has stretched over a very long time. How do you bind that all together?
It seems like you're on the edge of sort of like helping to tease that out a little bit. And certainly with the direct electrical recordings is that would be interesting. So one other thing that occurred to me as I was reading this is I can't get this one study out of my head where this group at UC Irvine, Jim McGaugh, studied this really unique population that has perfect autobiographical memory for everything that occurred ever in their life. And I was really disappointed because they had a paper that came out that was, it wasn't that sad. It was just using the technology at the time, and it was just sort of looking at the brains, and nothing really stood out. But I wonder if you took them and put them through, how they might look different in your paradigm.
Yeah. I'm also very curious about this. These people with these highly superior autobiographical memories. Yeah, I mean, we've tried to get at that from a slightly different angle in my lab by training people to use this memory palace method of loci memorization technique. And so a sort of nice thing about this approach is that it seems like just about anybody can learn it. So when we teach people to use the technique, we intentionally screen for people that like don't have great memories, that have average-ish memories to begin with. And this is a way that you can dramatically increase people's performance on these kinds of episodic memory tasks where you give them lists of words, for example, and they have to tell them back to you. And so this doesn't totally answer the question of how some people are doing this kind of thing without an explicit strategy, and it may or may not be the same. But the nice thing is that here we can get sort of like pre and post measures for the same individual where they're doing really bad on these tests and then now they're doing really well, and what changed, right? And what's different. And so we have one paper and press on this now and a couple more in the pipeline. And at least part of the answer has to do with these sort of contextual maps, right? So part of the way this technique works is that you ahead of time practice over and over this imagined spatial walk. Usually it's like through parts of your house. And then when you need to remember new things, you connect it to this map that you already have. And so there's a critical piece there, which is like having a place to put information and having a way to connect information to things you already know, which seems very important. And then there's another piece to this method too, which is the part that takes longer to practice and learn, which is you have to come up with like a reason for why that piece of information is connected to this location. And so, if you're trying to like remember the word baseball bat and you're trying to connect it to your front door, you need to imagine like, okay, the bat is like smashing against the door, or like maybe the door is a baseball bat now and you need to like swing it to open it or something, right? So you coming up with those connections also seems like a really critical thing for people to get good at this method. And that again is relying on something about your knowledge of the world, like how could objects interact? What are the like semantic similarities and differences between the bat and the door? So yeah, there's again ways of like trying to connect it to things. And my impression for a lot of these people with very good autobiographical memories is that they're just very effortlessly able to have these kinds of organizational systems that they kind of like sort things into like days of the week, and they like have these really rich contexts that like they're able to tell you a lot about what was going on in around these events as well, right? And so how they're able to do that without a strategy, I don't know, because even the people that we train in this memorization technique, even the people that we've also done neuroimaging on some of the people that are the champions that have compete in these memory competitions for years. But even these people, if they don't engage the technique on purpose, they don't have good memories. And so they causes some friction in their personal lives. Sometimes they like forget somebody's birthday. It's like, how could you forget? You're like the memory expert of the world. But, they do have to intentionally like bring this organizational system online, right? And so that's at least one difference that I don't know the explanation for.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like what your work is speaking to a lot, right, is this sort of contextualization that we always do. And if you, like you said, if you train people in memory policy, or even like thinking of like, chess experts, chess masters who, can look at a board and immediately memorize all the pieces because they have so much context to link it to. And I mean, it seems like that's sort of a principle of any sort of cognition. The more context you have, the better you are to navigate through that space more efficiently. And the brain naturally grows context. I mean, sometimes you can cognitively influence that by making strategies. Yeah, but it seems like it's, sort of fundamentally important in that regard. So I think that, and that sort of leads a little bit to, I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit about your paper looking at timing. Like when you presented this work at the workshop in 2021, people saw a movie and then they saw it twice. And you found that there was a slightly earlier activation in the higher cognitive areas of these episodes, of these motifs. I interpret that as not that the brain was somehow working faster. I interpret that as that the whole context was activated more readily. Like they recognized it and boom, like everything was there. I don't know. What was it was a while ago, but
Right. We were interested in the same question. So in this work, we find that like the second time through the movie, that you're going through a similar sequence of states, but you get into each state a little bit earlier. And so, so we were again using this hidden Markov modeling approach. You can do this as well, just looking at like sort of shifted correlations. A nice thing with the hidden Markov model approach is that the amount of the shift doesn't have to be exactly the same all the time, because it's sort of identifying when these switches happen. So using that, sort of more subtle approach, you can identify these kinds of shifts actually at a bunch of different time scales throughout the brain. And so, so one possibility is that you're sort of like primed to react to a new scene really quickly, because as soon as you see the first half second, you like know the thing that's coming, you can bring it online. Another possibility is that you actually, like as one scene is starting to come to a close, you know the thing that's going to come next, and you could start activating it before you even get there. So with fMRI, it's a little hard to tell the difference. We did try to do some analyses near the end of that paper where we tried to line up the timing of these shifts with like hand annotated moments when the actual scene shift happened. And at least for some of the regions, it seems like it is the case that your brain is shifting before you're seeing the next part of the stimulus. And so it's not purely being like faster to react, it's that you actually are able to use your episodic memory to start like reinstating the next scene before you get there. And this is maybe more true in these regions that seem like they have these longer horizons that they care about. And are thinking something more about what's coming next in the sequence. Oh yeah, one of the clips that we used here, this is from Miri Malley's work with the Grand Budapest Hotel data set that she collected. And so one of these clips is like this interview scene in the movie, and it seems like it's going pretty badly, but then the protagonist gets the job at the end. And so on your second watch, you sort of know something about the things that are coming, and there could be differences in how you're interpreting things, but also just the sort of timing of when you are relieved can happen a little bit earlier, right? You sort of know something about how these things are going to resolve. And so, yeah, we're actually continuing to look at this this data set. We have another paper that's in revision right now that's also looking at how this might change the timescales on later viewings. And do you become sort of like extra sensitive to fine scale perceptual information and create more events? Or do you kind of like chunk stuff up at slower timescales and create these sort of broader, more abstract events on later viewings? And so the answer seems to be a little bit of both. So we actually see some brain regions that go one way and some that go the other. And so these are maybe both kinds of processes that you want to be doing, that you want to be paying attention to perceptual details. We show that that's also has some relationships to people's memory performance later on, that getting some of this extra sensitivity, but you also maybe are able to extract some sort of slower timescale kinds of themes of a movie on a second rewatch.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's interesting. All right. So you're sort of like building this and even going further in terms of the slower timescales. Yeah, that's interesting. So in different scenes, I mean, how many different motifs or schemas do you have? I mean, is there overlap? It seems eventually, on a voxel-wise pattern, it seems like eventually there'll be some interference or in some sense. I mean, it seems like the brain, there's infinite context. And, does the brain solve this problem by like individual neurons or columns that, that sort of encode information, and they all kind of fire together in a certain way. And then that's sort of an attractor state that sort of is activated, and seems like there's maybe the potential for millions of that in prefrontal cortex or whatever.
Yeah, this question of how many sort of different states you can get into is a really interesting one. So, I mean, I think also, one distinction we make in some of this work is representations of sort of general schemas or event scripts that are things that you would see many times in your life, right? This is sort of general knowledge about things. And so, and then there's also the representations of the individual episode that's happening right now. And so, yeah, I mean, these individual episode representations seem that there's a very, very big space of like, possible events that you could imagine. And, even within the same movie, you could do a pretty good job of like, if you give me a brain pattern, I could tell you which scene that brain pattern is associated with. So the dimensionality here is high enough that we can do a pretty good job of dissociating every scene within the movie. And of course, scenes between different movies too might be even more different. And so, yeah, like how big of a space that is something that can be a bit challenging to measure. There's been some recent work. I think Michael Bonner actually has some work that just came out trying to estimate this as well, arguing that there's like hundreds of relevant dimensions in these event regions, that if you look at which of these dimensions are sort of consistent across different stimuli and things. And so it seems like there's something that's very high dimensional for these individual instance representations. For the pieces of these that are about these event scripts and these more general kind of motifs that span across different kinds of stories or movies. So yeah, these seem something that's maybe closer to like an attractor state or some kind of like library of patterns that you can bring back. And so, a big chunk of this pattern is something that is not even coming from this current stimulus. It's coming from your library of stuff that you know about the world. And so that I think is smaller, although still big enough that it's like kind of hard to think about how to get a handle on it within an experiment, because, there's how many different like kinds of routines or events do you know about in the world is probably hundreds or thousands. And so, yeah, in the study last year, we got like 16, I guess, which is like, we got 8 in one of them last year, which is like a lot more than 2, which is what we had been doing, but still feels pretty small compared to the space of things. And so, yeah, so that's something that's maybe more like lower dimensional in the sense that you want there to be shared structure across episodes. This is what allows you to connect them and generalize and make good predictions.
Yeah. Okay. That's very cool. I mean, and there's probably, if you have better tool, I mean, if you're able to probe, like maybe, potentially MEG, or might be able to probe, different temporal scales of these states or whatever, as far as that's concerned. So I actually wanted to go quickly into one other question before I go into your work on infants, which was also really fascinating. Just total tangential question. It seems that, I mean, this is along the lines of people who look at brain imaging to try to inform AI sort of architecture or modeling. It seems that the problem of context is a sticky one in AI. And it seems the brain, you know, has sort of solved that. And then sort of like you have evidence. I mean, obviously people know that, but then, there's growing evidence of, is there any hint that what you're showing might suggest different types of architectures for AI that somehow build, contextual knowledge in this way? Not that we really know the mechanisms by how the brain is doing that, but still.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree that I think a lot of what we think about as intelligent behavior is like the ability to recognize what kind of thing is happening here and to be able to like make a good prediction or take a good action or something by drawing on this past knowledge. And so the things like these large language models and other recent AI models, they sort of accomplish this by just having a, extremely complex set of parameters that you tune to try to figure out, like, in this situation, what is the next thing that's going to happen? And then it's, just this sort of massive black box of,
Yep.
Attention transformer things or
Yeah.
something. And so, I mean, I think in some ways that some parts of these neural schemas in humans might be kind of similar in the sense that you have, extracted some kind of statistical structure over your life and you can reactivate that structure to figure out next things that are happening. And it's not stored in a super explicit format that you would even be, like I was just saying of, how many things, like how many routines do I know about in my life? I can't like list them. They're not stored in that kind of format. But I do think that there's other things that humans do in a lot of these contexts, especially in a context where you really have expertise, like a chess grandmaster or something where I think it's not just statistical learning, it's also that you've actually come up with something that's a little closer to something like symbolic, or at least where you have more of an explicit model that you've created of like how this thing works. And when new things happen, you could say like, that makes sense to me, or it doesn't make sense to me and I need to update this model. And so, most of these modern AI models don't have that kind of piece to them where they are trying to learn models of the world. And so, definitely people are starting to move that direction with some things. So especially for people that are interested in like, how do you construct a coherent world model for a robot to make plans in or something, they've started to think more about like, what are the actual representations you'd want in this thing that you can learn. And I mean, I think another thing that's maybe missing from some of these current AI models is that there's not really a separation between like episodic knowledge of instances and this more general knowledge that these models memorize a lot of stuff in the training data. And so they can like retrieve specific things for you that they've seen in the past. And that's all just happening in the same kind of weight system as this general knowledge about the world. And so in humans, those seem to be things that are more separate, and you more explicitly try to build these generalized abstract structures that are move away from these individual episodes. And so, I think that's something that if you, especially as you want these AI models to be able to generalize well, to be able that, many of the kind of failures that we see in AI is that they're put in a situation that is a little different from something they've been in before, and they're sort of like pulling up the wrong instances or something. And so, having a more general model of how things work and being able to apply that to a new situation is something that I think humans are still quite a bit better at.
Yeah, right. I mean, obviously, we had billions of years of trying to tune this to, surviving, but it seems like, I mean, I'm trying to picture like, this mechanism by which, you have the neurons that are there, and they sort of are these motifs or these event structures are built over time and with experience and feedback, and it takes a long time. It takes a life to sort of develop these things. And yeah, it's interesting. But I wonder if, there's some sort of a way of setting up an architecture such that it does that type of thing. But there's a lot of gaps to fill in our understanding. But maybe that leads directly into your really cool study on infants. So you compared infants with adults on how well they discern event structures. And actually, to be honest, I actually wasn't quite sure how to interpret your results. I was sort of left a little bit like wondering what the main thrust is. And by the way, this paper, which was published in PNAS, it actually was a Cozzarelli Prize finalist. So it was a great paper. I think it sort of left everyone sort of thinking, what could this mean? Because it seems important.
This was sort of a dream project for me in the sense that this is a collaboration with Nick Turk-Brown's lab that was led by Tristan Yates. And it was perfect for me in the sense that they did the extremely hard work of collecting neuroimaging data from infants, which is something for collecting perceptual response data from awake infants was something that really had not been attempted until pretty recently. And then the question was like, what if we tried to take some of these models that we've applied to young adults and apply them down to, I think it's down to 3-month-old infants in this study. And so, I think there were a couple of things we were looking for. So one question was, what did the timescales look like in infants? And so at least my guess was that you would probably still have the fast timescale stuff. They're like responding to sensory things, but you wouldn't have the stable, slow timescale stuff in these higher level regions. And it turned out to be exactly the opposite. So actually the infants had nice, stable responses in these higher level regions. Now, like the content there was not right in the sense that the representations they form don't look like adult ones and like they don't switch at the right times. But that led me to actually think about this a little bit differently, that maybe these regions are maybe just inherently kind of slow, like they're looking for slow stuff in the world. And that's maybe a nice kind of biological bootstrapping that you get of they're trying to find out like what are the sort of slow chunks that make sense to have in the world. And so infants are already like trying to extract that, and they're not extracting the right stuff yet because they can't really like understand the movies that they're watching. But that those long timescales seem like there's something that's actually pretty inherent. We tried to do a bunch of control analyses to try to make sure that it wasn't just some kind of data quality thing that, noisy infants might look slow. And so, so that was part of the inspiration for the project I mentioned, of where we're trying to see like, can you change what slow stuff people are sensitive to in images? And is that something that you learn over time? Whereas the fact that you have a stable representation, maybe that's something that's more biological. And there's another finding that was in that study, as well as in other work that I had done with my postdoc, Samantha Cohen, showing that in children, you see some differences in the terms of the parts of the brain that are most synchronized versus the same finding in adults. So some of these things make sense. So the temporal parietal junction, for example, you don't see great synchronization there in kids. And that was pretty consistent with just that we think this region's doing a lot of like theory of mind, mentalizing kinds of stuff that kids are really bad at. And so that maybe makes sense that that's not really online. But we do see some parts of the posterior medial cortex, the posterior parietal cortex that actually are more synchronized in the infants and children compared to the young adults. And so, that's still a little more mysterious. I mean, I think our best guess about what's going on there is that part of this model that you're building is related to stuff that you're seeing on the screen, but it's also related to your specific interpretations of things, your particular past experiences. And so those things in some ways might diverge as you get older and have more of those kinds of experiences. And so, the particular memories that they pull up, something like that. So, for kids in some way, they're maybe all engaging with the more surface level pieces of this movie and not thinking much beyond that. And so they're all on the same page about what's going on. Whereas for adults, at least for certain kinds of stimuli, they might be having different reactions to it. And so there's something interesting there about, what are the things that sort of converge or diverge over the course of your life.
That's interesting. Right. I mean, it seems like, that, like you said, it starts out kind of like these long time scales and maybe some uncontrolled time scales, but then slowly it tightens up and it gets more specific. And as behaviors become more routine and learned, one thing that you showed that was kind of curious as well, that even the low level stuff, even like visual, was kind of slow. And that's sort of like indicative of the fact that they're not really processing these low level things as rapidly as adults.
That's right. Yeah, that was our interpretation there. Yeah, they're not tracking all these fine scale visual details. Some of this might, at least in the visual domain, it might also have to do with how they're choosing to move their eyes around or something as well. But yeah, it seems like that's also something you need to learn is how you're going to correctly direct your attention for these low level features.
Yeah. And so this infant study, I mean, right. I mean, it was really thought provoking in the sense that it almost suggests that people are trying to understand, mechanisms of psychiatric disorders. And to me, that my brain went to that in the sense that, okay, you have these infants developing these motifs. And it seems like psychiatric disorders could be defined as, oh, you're bringing the wrong, script online as a reaction to this. And it seems like early on, if, for instance, you had an overactive amygdala or something like that, it would like activate some script associated with some benign thing. And that would become more hardwired in some sense. I mean, it seems like there's maybe hints of mechanisms by which psychiatric disorders could have developed from this idea that the infant brain is sort of, it's sort of general, it's malleable, but then these things are forming and then they're tightening up, and how they form at that level would be really interesting to probe.
That's right. The question of how you create these kinds of schemas that you're going to activate later on, and are you activating them at the wrong time? So that we could definitely imagine for certain kinds of disorders that you are sort of pulling in the wrong script here. Yep. And so, I've been doing some collaborative work with Nim Tottenham in our department, looking at the development of affective schemas. And so this is primarily looking at attachment schemas. And this is sort of expectations that kids are building about, if I need my caregiver, are they going to respond to my request or not? And so this is something that is also, ends up being very clinically relevant in different populations. And NIMS also particularly has a lot of data from children that had some kind of disruption to their caregiving when they're young. And so we've been trying to look at their responses to movies that depict these kinds of attachment scenarios and asking, can we see some differences in brain responses or how they think about these kinds of movies? So we do see things, especially in amygdala connectivity to medial prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain, that seem to be different in kids that have different kinds of schemas. The interesting thing is that actually what mattered the most was how much children currently feel attachment to their current caregiver. And so if they have these schemas now or not, does seem to make a difference in this kind of processing. It actually mattered a little bit less what their history was. And so if you had children that had some big disruptions, but now are in a very secure attachment relationship, their responses look very similar to children that didn't have this kind of disrupted caregiving. And so it's, I think, a hopeful kind of result in the sense that it shows that these things are still kind of malleable, right? That they are important for how you're going to process the world, but it is something that you can try to relearn over time.
Yeah. That's cool. I mean, it seems like the intuition is that the malleability becomes a little bit less as you get older, but still it's nice to know that, right, there is this sort of, otherwise there's no hope. And one continues to learn, and hopefully, the entire field of behavioral therapy is based somewhat on this. And so it's interesting that to try to use this to inform maybe better interventions of some sort, which could be cool as far as, useful information. All right. So we're getting towards the end here. So, just quick question as to what do you think really excites you about not only your work, but the potential of generally what you're doing. And I think your avenue of more people should be working. I feel like this is a really rich area of paradigm design, processing, and sort of questions that sort of open up sort of new vistas of exploration. So what are you excited about now, and what's your hope for where it will go?
We have a few lines of research at the moment. And so one of them is trying to pull apart these sort of timescale questions in the brain. Another thing that I think is still a kind of unanswered question about these different timescales across regions is how they relate to other kinds of hierarchies in the brain. And so, for example, this work that Uri Hasson started of looking at these timescales in visual cortex, the longer and longer timescales also line up reasonably well with just the more traditional visual hierarchy of more and more abstract features that cover bigger and bigger parts of the image. And so the question is why are those two things lined up with each other? And so I think one explanation is that really what's important are these feature detectors, and the timescale stuff is kind of just has to do with the timescale at which those things occur in the world. And so the brain doesn't really care about timescales. It's just that if you have a scene detector in your brain that tells you what kind of place you're in, usually the place you're in doesn't change that fast. And so that's why it's slow, right? I think the other and maybe slightly more radical idea here is that the timescales are something that's maybe a little more intrinsic. So you have regions that care about fast stuff and slow stuff, and they come to represent things that usually occur at those timescales. And so, yes, I mentioned a little bit, we're doing this project of trying to this is work with my grad student, Zal Hirstein. That's a collaborative work with Miriam Alley, where we've been trying to create different kinds of image sequences that might have weird timescale properties where, the low level features are slower, for example. And so, I think that the bigger question this is trying to get at is questions about, to what extent are these timescale differences in the brain a good kind of organizing principle for how the brain develops and learns. And I think there's a possibility that they're actually maybe a really important kind of intrinsic bias that you can have in your brain before you are even really exposed to the world is that you can be sort of knowing that you need to look for slow stuff, and could have circuits that maintain activity over a long period of time, and then you could tune them to things in the world. And so that's something it's a challenging question to answer, because it's kind of also a whole life development kind of question, to really think about the extent to which these timescales shape the development of the brain. There's another thing we're really interested in, which is thinking about these predictions the brain is making. And so, so first of all, like getting a better understanding of how these predictions arise, what neural circuits give rise to these predictions. I'd had my PhD student who just defended, Jiawen Wang, did a bunch of really cool studies of getting people to build expertise in this board game, and then looking at how this changed the kinds of predictions that they made, both behaviorally, and we have a neuroimaging version that we're finishing up now. And so understanding what the sort of basis is for this, and again, this is maybe sort of one of the main points of activating a context, is so that you can try to make some kind of predictions and make better decisions about what's coming up. And then also understanding the consequences of, like, when those predictions succeed or fail, what do you do in response to that, and how does it change the way you remember things? This is something that I think a lot of the work in the memory world, at least, is like very split about, like, does it enhance or hurt memory if something happens you didn't expect? And so there's certainly a lot of cases where it should help, in the sense that, like, if you make a really bad decision and you get a really bad negative reward that you didn't expect, you should really remember that for the future. That's like really important. But there's also cases where, like, something happens that's just like a kind of one-off thing that's like a little bit weird, where something happened that was a little atypical, that's maybe not so important for the future, that you wouldn't expect that to happen again. Those kinds of things people like can't remember at all. And so there's something happening there where you're making some kind of decision about prioritizing, like, is this a prediction failure? That's something that I need to fix. When things happen that you expect, often you can remember them pretty well, because you can kind of start like laying down the memory before the event even happens. And so you can like, you cheat a little bit, where you have like extra exposure sort of that you before this thing happened. And so so I think pulling those apart is something that the field hasn't really done. There's, I think, some slightly tricky theoretical questions here too, about things that are happening that are really sort of true predictions, that are cognitive processes that happen before you see this outcome. And then I think there's a lot of stuff happening after you see the outcome, where you're trying to think, like, did this effect make sense as connecting to a cause in the past? And so we have some work, Jiawen has some work trying to argue that that's actually like a different piece of this, that even if you didn't make a prediction ahead of time, when something happens that connects well to stuff that you know and expectations that you sort of good, that's a context appropriate kind of thing that happens, that can also have big impacts on memory. So we're trying to understand those pieces. And again, I think that there's some interesting theoretical frameworks there to understand as well.
Yeah. I mean, couldn't that be also just sort of like learning what's salient is sort of like a meta motif in some sense? It's like kind of like, you have these things, but then you kind of learn what is salient and what's important. And then that's sort of another level of abstraction of the context.
That's right. I think there's something that's important about, like, when something turned out a way you didn't expect, can you like figure out an explanation for it, and maybe a way that you could change your decisions or your model of the world to incorporate that, right? And I think if you can, that episode can have a big impact on your memory and your models of the world. And I think if you don't have a way to integrate it, then it seems like it just kind of falls away, in the sense that you don't have a way to make sense of this. You don't really have a way to improve your behavior for next time. And so that stuff seems to get forgotten, right? And so it's, definitely also related to decades of work that Janet Metcalf has done in our department, thinking about, like, there's this sort of zone of stuff that you're able to learn, which are things that are like sort of just outside your current knowledge, where if I give you an example of this, you could like figure out how to modify your current understanding of the world to incorporate this. And if you show people things that are too far outside of that, they like have no understanding of how you'd even like incorporate this in a model, right? And so, so I think this idea of like, are unpredicted things, what kind of impact do they have, and what impact do they have on memory? I think it depends a lot on these other kinds of questions.
Yeah. That's so cool. It's so fun. I feel like jumping into this research more myself, trying to get my postdocs to change direction. Yeah. I mean, there's so many other questions. We didn't even talk about emotion, but within a sudden emotional event, I mean, it seems like that upregulates everything and just causes you to be more, it's very much of a regulator of what you remember and gain experience from, in some sense. Yeah. Just the last question then. So is there any, a lot of people listening to this podcast are junior scientists or postdocs or graduate students. What sort of advice would you just generally give them, maybe even about what you're doing, or maybe in terms of what's most fruitful, in terms of maybe heuristics that you followed in terms of finding what you do.
Yeah, I sometimes struggle with this because I feel like I kind of wandered around a little bit until I found stuff, and so I don't know how to tell people to replicate that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's some kinds of skills that are almost always valuable. Some of these are just like technical skills that I think having enough sort of programming expertise to be able to like design interesting kinds of paradigms and do some of your own custom analyses, I think just opens up huge amounts of things, especially maybe more for psychology students that might not be exposed as much to this in their coursework. That's something that, I teach the statistics class in our psych department, and I just sneakily put in a bunch of R programming stuff. There's a little resistance you have to get over of people being afraid to program, but I think it's actually, we teach a very small piece of R, but I think it gives people just so much more flexibility in terms of, by the final project, we're basically telling them like, here's a data set, and they can design their own visualizations for it. They can design their own statistics for it. And so I think those kinds of skills, no matter where you end up, will be super useful. I think for studying cognition, I've seen people get very boxed into, that their project or their lab focuses on maybe one particular kind of paradigm or effect. And they, maybe go down a little bit of a rabbit hole of like, can we understand exactly all the things that influence this particular kind of behavior? And I think that can be super valuable. I think especially for behaviors that we think are really important and we don't understand well, it makes sense to like really try to pull apart every piece. But I do think it's important to have this a little broader exploratory view too, of thinking about like, what are the kinds of cognitive processes that we think are important for understanding human behavior? And I think a lot of those are stuff that it's like, they're not always easily, there's often we don't have a paradigm for studying them. And we could try to think about what are ways that we could study them. And, I think the answer is not just like, go, completely hands off and let's just like record people's brains as they move about in the world. There is some cool work now with these like chronically implanted intracranial things that are doing some stuff like that. But, I think we still need to think about how you can put this into a scientific paradigm where there's going to be, proper controls and analyses where we could say something about how things are related. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe this is just my overall view of neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience is that I think we're really still in this very early stage of like, we still don't have good sort of big theories that like connect across different kinds of paradigms and connect across different modalities and scales of the brain. I'm not sure we even like totally know what the like important things are yet.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, so I'd like encourage people not to get too narrow in terms of, I think that if you're in a field like physics, they'll build an accelerator and spend 20 years trying to find the value of a particular parameter. And I think that makes sense if you're physics and you have a model that we like basically works and we need to know the details. I think neuroscience is like maybe, a century out from that at the moment.
Yeah,
and so,
at least.
So that, and this is maybe part of the reason that I, came to and stayed in neuroscience is that I think there's still a lot of big ideas that we haven't found yet. And I think that it's an exciting thing as a young person in science to know that you're in a field where like, we still don't really know what we're doing and what's going on, that there's room for, I think, creative approaches that we haven't found yet. And my hope is that we could start building these models that are something where we could really start like making really quantitatively testable hypotheses about different, how the different things should work and how things should fit together.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. I mean, I think I really resonate with the idea that you need to build these connections and you have to keep your mind open. And as far as that's concerned, and understand that, right, we don't know. I mean, we tend to get myopic prematurely. And yeah, I mean, we don't even have good models to link up our data across scales and across, modalities. Awesome advice. And well, this hour and 20 minutes went super fast. And well, I really appreciate your coming on and wish you the best in the future.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I think maybe I often like the question and answer parts of my talk the best. And so this was like a full, just only question and answer part. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks.
Neurosalience is brought to you by the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode is produced by Zhuqian Michelle Lee.